A long-buried story allegedly tied to Meghan Markle's early life starts resurfacing in this narrative, pulling viewers straight into a swirl of whispers, claims, and controversy that never fully disappeared from online discussion. Before the world knew her as a royal figure or global celebrity, this version of events claims she once lived a completely different chapter in Chicago, where a man named Joe Giuliano is described as her early romantic partner and even, in some accounts, a first husband in a private and disputed arrangement. According to these circulating claims, Joe's family did not accept the relationship, and tensions reportedly grew so intense that the connection was eventually cut off and erased from their lives, leaving behind silence, confusion, and a trail of unanswered questions. Some versions of the story even allege that years later, Joe Giuliano himself or people connected to him began speaking out after decades of staying quiet, and those alleged remarks are described as shocking to those hearing them for the first time. In this narrative, the relationship is painted as something that began quietly and simply, far away from fame, royalty, or media attention, just two young people supposedly caught in a private bond that nobody expected to matter later on. But as the story continues, the tone shifts sharply, suggesting that behind the early charm and normalcy, there were growing concerns within the Giuliano family about personality differences, ambition, and trust, which supposedly created emotional distance and rising suspicion. The family, described in these claims as traditional and protective, is said to have started noticing inconsistencies in conversations and details that didn't always align perfectly, fueling doubts that slowly changed how they viewed the relationship. One repeated allegation in this narrative claims that small biographical details, including timelines and personal background statements, became points of tension, with some family members allegedly questioning whether everything being shared was fully accurate. These claims go further by suggesting that confusion around personal history created deeper mistrust, though none of this is supported by verified public records, and remains part of rumor-based storytelling circulating online. As the story escalates, it introduces the idea of a private marriage in Las Vegas, described as quiet, hidden, and never publicly acknowledged, adding another layer of mystery to the already controversial narrative being told. According to the same storyline, that marriage was short-lived and quickly ended, with documents allegedly sealed or removed from public view, creating the impression that the entire chapter was deliberately erased. Shortly after, the narrative claims Joe stepped away from public attention entirely, while his family also chose silence, refusing to engage with outside curiosity or media speculation about what actually happened. But as Meghan Markle's real-world public profile grew over time, especially through entertainment and later royal association, this story says old whispers began resurfacing, pulling attention back to a chapter many believed was long gone. Those repeating the claims argue that people from the past started questioning why such an early relationship was never mentioned in later interviews or biographies, treating the absence itself as something suspicious or meaningful. However, it is important to note within this rewritten framing that none of these claims are confirmed by reliable documentation, and much of what is described exists only within online rumor cycles and speculative retellings. Still, the narrative pushes forward with dramatic questions, asking why an entire relationship would allegedly disappear from public record, and whether silence was intentional, accidental, or simply the result of forgotten history. It even suggests, through speculative language, that every erased detail fuels curiosity rather than ending it, turning absence into a kind of mystery that people try to decode long after the fact. From there, the story shifts into a broader reflection on Meghan's supposed early environment, describing a contrast between ambition-driven goals and traditional family expectations that allegedly clashed during that period. The Giuliano family is portrayed in these claims as rooted in routine, structure, and privacy, valuing stability over visibility, while Meghan is described in the narrative as someone focused on opportunity, exposure, and forward movement. According to this version of events, that difference in outlook slowly created emotional distance, with missed gatherings, reduced communication, and growing misunderstandings becoming part of the tension between both sides. Some quoted remarks within the narrative claim that family members felt she was always chasing something bigger, while others allegedly believed she didn't prioritize long-term grounding in the same way they did. In contrast, the narrative also presents Meghan's perspective as being driven by ambition and personal vision, suggesting she was focused on building a future beyond the limits of her immediate surroundings. As the tension builds in this retelling, the relationship between Joe and his family is described as becoming increasingly strained, with conversations reportedly turning shorter, colder, and more difficult over time. Eventually, the story claims that the emotional distance became too large to ignore, leading to separation and the quiet dissolution of the connection, though again these details remain part of unverified storytelling rather than established fact. Even after the alleged breakup, the narrative insists that traces of the past continue to echo through later years, resurfacing whenever Meghan's name appeared in global headlines. This version of events suggests that people interpreted her later success through the lens of earlier rumors, trying to connect dots between past relationships and future fame in ways that remain speculative and unproven. What makes the story more dramatic, according to the narrative, is the idea that silence itself became part of the mystery, with no official statements confirming or denying the alleged early marriage. Some observers in this retelling argue that families choose silence to protect privacy, while others interpret silence as evidence of something intentionally hidden, even though neither conclusion is verifiable. As the discussion continues, the story circles back to Chicago, painting a picture of a quiet household where early questions about Meghan Markle's past were allegedly raised long before she became a global public figure. In this version of events, those questions were not driven by public scandal or media pressure, but by personal confusion, cultural differences, and clashing expectations between two very different worlds. The narrative ends this segment by reinforcing the idea that sometimes early chapters of a life remain unresolved, not because they are hidden, but because they are interpreted differently by everyone involved, leaving behind a story that continues to be debated rather than confirmed. What begins as a supposedly simple love story quickly shifts in tone once the narrative moves past the early celebration phase, revealing tension, ambition, and emotional distance that allegedly built up behind closed doors. In this version of events, the relationship between Meghan Markle and Joe Giuliano is described as starting with affection and excitement, but slowly changing as reality set in and both sides began pulling in different directions emotionally and mentally. The Giuliano family is portrayed as deeply traditional, protective of their name, and committed to keeping personal matters private, while Meghan is framed as independent, ambitious, and focused on building a future far beyond the environment she was in. According to these claims, her desire for growth and movement clashed with the family's expectation of loyalty and stability, creating friction that became harder to ignore as time passed. Then the narrative introduces a dramatic turning point, suggesting that rumors of a pregnancy began circulating quietly within the family circle, sparking confusion, fear, and tension that nobody wanted to address publicly. Instead of a loud confrontation, the story describes something much more subdued and unsettling, a quiet decision reportedly made around a family table where emotions were contained, but the atmosphere was heavy and final. It is alleged in this retelling that the Giulianos prioritized protecting their privacy above all else, choosing to manage the situation internally rather than allow any public attention or media exposure. At the same time, Meghan is described as being given a difficult choice in this narrative, one that supposedly involved continuing her personal ambitions while distancing herself from the past tied to the family. By the mid-1990s, the story claims a child was born, though details surrounding the birth remain vague, inconsistent, and wrapped in layers of uncertainty and rumor rather than confirmed fact. Some versions of the narrative suggest that the child was occasionally seen at family gatherings but never formally introduced, never publicly acknowledged, and never clearly connected to any official records. However, it is important to emphasize that these claims are part of unverified storytelling and should be treated as speculation rather than established truth. The story continues by saying that Joe allegedly remained nearby, maintaining limited contact, while Meghan was already shifting focus toward education, auditions, and early career opportunities. In this framing, her life is portrayed as accelerating forward into acting ambitions and personal development, while the relationship behind her slowly dissolved into distance and emotional separation. To the Giuliano family, according to this narrative, her departure was not seen as simple progression, but rather as abandonment of family ties and shared responsibility. One quoted sentiment attributed to someone close to the situation claims she left everything that made her one of us, reflecting the emotional weight and resentment allegedly felt at the time. As the relationship ends in this version of events, the breakup is described not as a dramatic public collapse, but as a quiet legal separation handled away from public view. The narrative suggests an annulment was processed privately, with paperwork sealed or restricted, reinforcing the idea of a deliberate effort to avoid public attention. It further claims that a silence agreement or mutual understanding was part of the separation, though no verifiable evidence supports these assertions. Whether financial arrangements were involved is presented as uncertain within the story, with conflicting claims suggesting either compensation or simply mutual agreement to part ways quietly. Despite the separation, the narrative emphasizes that emotional traces remained within the family, describing lingering memories, unresolved questions, and a sense of something unfinished. It is said that certain reminders of the past were never fully removed, symbolizing how deeply the alleged experience impacted those involved. From an outside perspective in this narrative, Meghan Markle is later portrayed as someone who built herself into a public figure through determination and image crafting, rising far beyond her early surroundings. But from the viewpoint of the Giuliano family in this retelling, she is described as someone who left behind stability and loyalty in pursuit of a much larger life trajectory. This contrast becomes the emotional center of the story, framing the situation not just as a breakup, but as a divide between two completely different visions of life. The narrative then shifts into a new chapter focused on disappearance, claiming that the Giuliano family eventually left Chicago under mysterious and abrupt circumstances. Their departure is described as sudden, quiet, and highly organized, with neighbors allegedly noticing an early morning moving truck and an unusually empty home by midday. Everything in the house is said to have been cleared out quickly, leaving behind a stripped, silent space that no longer reflected the life that once existed there. Neighbors in this version of events are portrayed as confused and speculative, offering theories ranging from financial trouble to more serious and unexplained concerns. The story intensifies by introducing the idea that the family did not simply relocate, but intentionally erased their presence, cutting off contact, phone lines, and any visible trace of their identity. As time passes, the narrative claims fragments of their existence begin appearing in unexpected places across Europe, including bank records and property references tied to unfamiliar names. A reserved couple is described living in a small Italian coastal town, keeping to themselves, avoiding attention, and living under slightly altered identities. They are said to have lived quietly with a child who remained mostly unseen, rarely attending school, and rarely interacting with the community around them. In this retelling, secrecy is described as almost cultural in the region, where privacy is respected and questions are rarely asked openly. A brief incident involving a photograph at a village festival is included, where a man allegedly steps away from the camera, avoiding identification and reinforcing the mystery surrounding the family. Later, the narrative claims that investigators, attempting to reconstruct Meghan Markle's early timeline, discovered gaps in records, missing months, and unclear documentation that fueled further speculation. It even references an alleged photograph near Lake Como, where a partially obscured figure appears in the background, though its authenticity and interpretation remain highly disputed. These elements are used in the narrative to suggest hidden connections, although no verified evidence confirms such links or conclusions. As speculation grows, the story presents multiple theories, including hidden identities, deliberate disappearance, and unknown family ties, all of which remain unproven and speculative. Ultimately, The Giuliano family's silence is framed as both protection and mystery, with their disappearance becoming the central unanswered question of the narrative. Today, the abandoned Chicago home is described as still standing, frozen in time, with neighbors claiming it carries an eerie stillness that feels untouched by history. Some even repeat stories of faint sounds or memories tied to the house, though these accounts are part of local folklore rather than confirmed reality. In the final framing of this segment, the narrative suggests that the family's disappearance may have been driven not by escape alone, but by a desire to protect something deeply private and never meant for public discovery. And beneath all the speculation, unanswered questions, and fragmented accounts, the story closes on the lingering thread that started it all, leaving it unresolved and still surrounded by mystery. The forgotten ties of Meghan Markle. Decades have passed, yet within this fictionalized narrative space, the whispers never fully fade, instead shifting shape over time as new interpretations, online theories, and fragmented retellings continue to build on top of one another, like layers of unfinished history. Between public fame and private speculation lies a story that, in this dramatized version, refuses to settle into anything concrete, existing instead as a constantly evolving mystery shaped by uncertainty, curiosity, and the human tendency to connect incomplete dots. The name Giuliano appears throughout this narrative framework as a symbolic thread tied to disputed archives, redacted references, and fragmented records that some online observers interpret as meaningful, even though no verified documentation supports such conclusions. In this storytelling version, a fictional freelance journalist named Aaron Vale becomes the central figure, portrayed as someone drawn into a much larger puzzle while working through unrelated historical inheritance files in Rome. What begins as ordinary archival research is described as gradually shifting into obsession, as he allegedly encounters repeated inconsistencies, missing pages, altered timestamps, and scattered signatures that seem to reappear in unrelated documents across different locations. Each new discovery in the narrative leads him deeper into what feels like an interconnected maze, where every answer appears to split into multiple new uncertainties. Instead of resolving anything clearly, he is said to have followed these traces through immigration logs, old parish records, and outdated travel documentation, suggesting that a family once lived quietly in southern Italy before fading from public visibility in the late 1990s. Local recollections within the story describe, in uncertain and inconsistent ways, a couple named Joseph and Anna Lucia Giuliano, though even these memories are portrayed as fragmented and shaped by time rather than certainty. But the narrative turns sharply when the investigation is disrupted, not by documents, but by an anonymous message containing a single blurred photograph sent without explanation or context. The image is described as showing a quiet street near a flower stall, where two figures appear partially obscured, captured in a moment that invites interpretation rather than confirmation. Within the story's framework, viewers interpret resemblance, posture, and expression differently, showing how perception can influence belief even when evidence remains unclear or unverified. The metadata attached to the image is said within the narrative, only to place it in 2015, which becomes a point of speculation because of its proximity to later well-known public events involving Meghan Markle. However, this entire interpretation is framed strictly as part of online myth-making within the story world, not as confirmed history or documented fact. As the fictional investigation continues, Aaron is repeatedly met with silence, deflection, or sudden disappearance of previously accessible records, creating a sense of instability around everything he tries to verify. Officials in the narrative are described as becoming less responsive over time, while archives that once seemed reliable begin showing inconsistencies when revisited or cross-checked. A notary in Milan is said to confirm the existence of a sealed legal transaction linked to a trust associated with the Giuliano name, though no further details are ever released or verified within the storyline. At the same time, additional rumors emerge within the narrative ecosystem, including references to brief media reports that were allegedly published and later withdrawn without explanation. There are also speculative mentions of citizenship applications and surname links, but again, these elements remain unverified and exist only within the fictional framework of the story. An aging priest character is introduced as a symbolic voice of ambiguity, offering the line, "You cannot bury the truth, it grows roots even in stone," which is used to represent how stories persist through repetition rather than evidence. In this version of events, Aaron becomes increasingly isolated, portrayed as someone who believes the photograph is not meaningless, but instead a fragment of something larger he has yet to fully understand. Still, the narrative repeatedly reminds the audience that no confirmed evidence exists to support the interpretations being explored, and that much of what is described belongs to speculation, imagination, and reinterpretation. Yet the fascination continues because unanswered questions often travel further than confirmed answers, especially in digital spaces where stories evolve through repetition and engagement. The idea of disappearance in this narrative is no longer treated as literal, but symbolic, representing how information can fade, resurface, and transform depending on who is telling the story. As the story expands, it becomes less about solving a mystery and more about understanding how mysteries are created, shaped, and amplified over time through fragmented storytelling. Even the photograph itself shifts meaning, becoming less of a potential clue and more of a symbol of interpretation, where every viewer sees something slightly different depending on expectation and belief. And in that space of uncertainty, the narrative refuses closure, circling back again to the same unanswered question that has driven it from the beginning. So what do you think really happened in this version of the story between Meghan and the Giuliano family? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more episodes, more theories, and more unexplained mysteries as they continue to unfold.